Secondly, in the matter of maintaining this testimony, these famous fathers, while faithful to God, gave us a perfect pattern for purity and strictness in opposition to all degrees of conformity and compliance with the corruptions of the time, and laid down such rules and constitutions as might regulate us in our contendings about present defections, and teach us what account to make of them and how to carry towards them. Which, if adverted unto, would evince how manifest and manifold the declinings of many have been from the late Reformation, that yet pretend to adhere unto it, and how justifiable the aversion and abstraction of the present reproaching suffering party is from all these defections and the daubings of them, because so much deviating and declining from the attained Reformation. I need not repeat how prelacy and all the parts and pentacles of that anti-Christian hierarchy were abjured in the National Covenant, and condemned in the Acts of Assemblies, and re-abjured in the Solemn League and Covenant, and in the solemn acknowledgment of sins and engagement to duties, where also we came under sacred and inviolable engagements to endeavor the extirpation thereof, which doth clearly file the present countenancing and submitting to the Prelatical Curates, in receiving ordinances from them among the grossest of defections, being altogether inconsistent with these acts and constitutions and covenant obligations to extirpate them, as much as the countenancing of Popish priests were inconsistent therewith, being both equally covenanted to be extirpated. Next, though in this period tyranny, being in its retrograde motion, Erastian supremacy was not so much contended for, and therefore not so much questioned as formerly, being held exploded without execration, out of doors and out of doubt, yet the testimony was still continued against it, in the uninterrupted maintaining of the Church's privileges and freedom of assemblies against all encroachings of adversaries. And therefore the embracing of the late detestable indulgences were as contrary to the actings of this as to the testimonies of the former period against the supremacy from which they flow. Yea, many particulars might be instanced wherein the acceptors had declined from the covenanted Reformation then prosecuted, not only in their confederating with malignant usurpers for the pretended benefit of them, by which, if there had been no more, they are obnoxious to the censure of the Church, standing registered in an act of assembly, ordaining all persons in ecclesiastic office for the like or lesser degrees of compliance, yea, even for prosecuting protections from malignant enemies, to be suspended from their office and all exercise thereof, at Edinburgh 1646, session 14. Nor only in their taking sinful instructions from them, restricting them in exercise of their ministry, but in admitting themselves by their patronage to be by them presented to their prelimited and preimposed congregations, which involves them in the iniquity of the abolished patronages condemned by the assembly. For that ministry of such, so presented, is made too much to depend upon the will and pleasure of man, and such an imposition is destructive of the Church and people's liberties, obstructive of the gospel's freedom and faithful plainness, and occasion of much base flattery and partiality, and in subjecting to, homologating, and fortifying a sacrilegious supremacy, overturning the intrinsic power of the Church, contrary to the covenant obliging to the preservation of the government, as well as to the doctrine of the Church in the first article thereof, and in their suffering themselves, either directly or indirectly, either by combination, persuasion, or terror, to be divided and withdrawn from that blessed union and conjunction which they were obliged to maintain and promote, according to the 6th article of the Solemn League and Covenant, in their strengthening the Erastian usurpations of enemies encroaching upon the Church's liberties and Christ's prerogatives, against which we are engaged expressly in the solemn acknowledgment of sins and engagement to duties, where also we have these words, Article 2, because many have of late labored to supplant the liberties of the Church, we shall maintain and defend the Church of Scotland in all her liberties and privileges against all who shall oppose and undermine the same, or encroach thereupon under any pretext whatsoever. Next, we have many demonstrations of the zeal and strictness of these servants of Christ in their synodical determinations of censures, to be passed upon many ministerial corruptions, which will condemn the present course of covering and countenancing them, and commend the contendings of a poor reproached party against them in their conscientious abstracting from them. Of which determinations I shall rehearse some. Among the enormities and corruptions of the ministry in their callings, this is one, section 4 and 5, Silence in the public cause, some accounting it a point of wisdom to speak ambiguously, whereof the remedy is, section 15, quote, that beside all other scandals, silence or ambiguous speaking in the public cause be seasonably censured. General Assembly at Edinburgh, June 13, 1646, unquote. There is indeed an act against withdrawers from ministers, but in the selfsame act they are charged, to be diligent in fulfilling their ministry. Quote, to be faithful in preaching, declaring the whole counsel of God, as they have occasion from the text of Scripture to reprove the sins and errors, and press the duties of the time, and in all these to observe the rules prescribed by the acts of assembly, wherein, if they be negligent, they are to be censured. General Assembly, Edinburgh, August 24th, 1647, session 19, unquote. Then there is that act, August 3rd, 1648, session 26, for censuring ministers for their silence and not speaking to the corruptions of the time, quote, calling it a great scandal, and through some ministers there reserving and not declaring themselves against the prevalent sins of the times, appointing that all that do not apply their doctrine to these corruptions, which is the pastoral gift, and that are cold or wanting of spiritual zeal, dissembling of public sins, and, that all such be censured, even to deprivation, for forbearing or passing in silence the errors and exorbitancies of sectaries in England, or the defections current at home, the plots and practices of malignants, the principles and tenets of Erastianism, and if they be found too sparing, general, or ambiguous in their applications and reproofs, and continuing so, they are to be deposed for being pleasers of men rather than servers of Christ, for giving themselves to a detestable indifferency or neutrality in the cause of God, for defrauding the souls of people, yea, for being highly guilty of the blood of souls in not giving them warning, unquote. And in that seasonable and necessary warning of the General Assembly, Edinburgh, July 27, 1649, session 27, we are taught how they resented the unfaithfulness of ministers continuing in defections, and how we are to look upon them and to carry to them, where they say it is undeniably true that many of the evils, quote, wherewith this church and kingdom hath been afflicted in our age, have come to pass because of the negligence of some and corruptions of others of the ministry, and the course of backsliding was carried on until it pleased God to stir up the spirits of these few who stood in the gap to oppose and resist the same, and to begin the work of reformation in the land. Since which time the silence of some ministers and the compliance of others hath had great influence upon the backslidings of many amongst the people, who, upon the discovery of the evil of their way, complained that they got no warning, or that if they were warned by some, others held their peace, or to justify them in the course of their backsliding. We can look upon such ministers no otherwise than upon these that are guilty of the blood of the Lord's people, and with whom the Lord will reckon. For all the breach of covenant and defection that hath been in the land, the priest's lips should preserve knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord's hosts. But such as are departed out of the way, and have caused many to stumble at the law, therefore hath the Lord made them contemptible before all the people, according as they have not kept his ways, but have been partial in his law, because they have lost their favor. He hath cast out many of them as unsavory salt, unquote. Furthermore, to evidence the purity and power of zeal burning and blazing in these days in their contendings against public enemies on all hands, I shall instance some of their acts and testimonies, clearly condemning the manifold compliances of this generation, and which may contribute somewhat to justify the reproached preciseness of a remnant standing at the furthest distance from them. There is an act for censuring the compliers with the public enemies of this church and kingdom. General Assembly, June 17, 1646, session 14, quote, where they judge it is a great and scandalous provocation and grievous defection from the public cause to comply with those malignants, such as James Graham then was, in any degree, even to procure protections from them, or to have invited them to their houses, to have drunk James Graham's health, or to be guilty of any other such gross degrees of compliance, censured, to be suspended from the communions, and while they acknowledge their offense, unquote. And yet now, for refusing these degrees of compliance, for not having the protection of a pass from the wicked courts of malignant enemies by taking a wicked oath, and for refusing to drink the king's health, a greater enemy than ever James Graham was, some poor conscientious people have not only been murdered by enemies, but mocked and condemned by professors. There is an act likewise, and declaration against all new oaths or bonds in the common cause imposed without consent of the Church General Assembly, Edinburgh, July 28, 1648, Session 18, quote, enjoining all the members of the Church to forbear the swearing or subscribing any new oaths or bonds in this cause without advice and concurrence of the Church, especially any negative oaths or bonds which may any way limit or restrain them in the duties whereunto they are obliged by national or solemn league and covenant, unquote. Yet now for refusing oaths, not only limited in covenanted duties, but contradicting and condemning many material principles of the covenanted Reformation, many have not only lost their lives, but also been condemned, by them that are at ease, having a wider conscience to swallow such baits. It is known how pernicious the most faithful in those days were in their contendings against associations in any undertaking for the cause with persons disaffected to the true state thereof. I need not give any account of this, were it not that now that principle is quite inverted, and poor adherers to it, for their abstracting and subtracting their concurrence with such promiscuous associations as are much hated and flouted. Therefore I shall give some hints of their sentiments of them. In their answer to the Committee of Estates, July 25th, 1648, Session 14, the General Assembly says, quote, it was represented to the Parliament that for securing of religion it was necessary that the Popish, Prelatical, and malignant party be declared enemies to the cause upon the one hand, as well as sectaries upon the other, and that all associations either in forces or councils with the former as well as the latter be avoided, unquote. And in their declaration concerning the present dangers of religion, especially the unlawful engagement in war, July 1648, Session 21, they say, quote, suppose the ends of that engagement be good, as they are not, yet the means and ways of prosecution are unlawful, because there is not an equal avoiding of rocks on both hands, but a joining with malignants to suppress sectaries, a joining hands with a black devil to beat a white devil. They are bad physicians who would so cure one disease as to breed another as evil or worse. We find in the Scriptures condemned all confederacies and associations with the enemies of true religion, whether Canaanites, Exodus 23, verse 32 and 24, Exodus 12, verse 15, Deuteronomy 7, verse 2, or other heathens, 1 Kings 11, verses 1 and 2, unquote. More arguments against associations may be seen in that excellent discussion of this useful case concerning associations and confederacies with idolaters, infidels, heretics, or any other known enemy of truth or godliness by famous Mr. George Gillespie, published at that same time, whereunto is appended his letter to the Commission of the General Assembly, having these golden words in it, fitly spoken in that season, when he was a-dying at the beginning of the public resolutions. Quote, having heard of some motions and beginnings of compliance with these who have been so deeply engaged in a war destructive to religion and the kingdom's liberties, I cannot but discharge my conscience in giving a testimony against all such compliance. I know and am persuaded that all the faithful witnesses that gave testimony to these that the late engagement was contrary and destructive to the covenant will also give testimony to the appendix that compliance with any who have been effective in that engagement is most sinful and unlawful. I am not able to express all the evils of that compliance. They are so many. But above all, that which would heighten this sin even to the heavens is that it were not only a horrid backsliding, but a backsliding into that very sin which was specifically pointed out and punished by the prevalency of the malignant party, God justly making them thorns and scourges who were taken in as friends. Alas, shall we split twice upon the same rock? Yea, run upon it, when God hath set a beacon on it? Yea, I may say, shall we thus outface and outdare the Almighty, by protecting his and our enemies, by making peace and friendship with them, when the anger of the Lord is burning against them? I must here apply to our present condition the words of Ezra in Ezra 9, verse 14. O happy Scotland, if thou canst not improve and not abuse this golden opportunity, But if thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord, wrath upon wrath and woe upon woe shall be upon thee from the Lord." Unquote.